By way of introduction, welcome. My name is Sherry Horde. I'll be facilitating this session, and I'm joined by Aaron O'Neill, and we're working on a project that increases collaboration and capacity building in the third sector. Now, our definition of the third sector is pretty much everyone outside of government and private sector. So if you're in the right place, specifically if you're representing a charity or a nonprofit or working with charities and nonprofits, you might also be in an association or a society, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And the reason this came to be, some of you would have joined us last November when we had what we called a third sector collaborative. And what it ended up being was people across the third sector. And we talked about what is our vision for the third sector in Barbados? And what are the challenges that are keeping us from getting there? And from that, as I mentioned, collaboration and capacity building were two themes that came out. So obviously today, this is all about capacity building and building up the knowledge of the third sector and the knowledge base. And this is our third webinar. And so we had one on volunteering, and there was some magic happened in that one where people reached out and said, I can actually help you with that need that you have. And we talked about being very specific about needs when you're looking for volunteers. And then we had a second webinar, which talked about the value proposition. So one of the things that had come up in the third sector collaborative was, how do we as a third sector in our organizations demonstrate value so that we can give the ultimate of what we have to offer the market and get in return effective remuneration for that. And then this is third of the series, and this one is a little more technical in nature, and it's to deal with the register, how you register, and what your ongoing obligations would be, specifically for charities and nonprofits. And I'll show you the agenda in a minute, and we'll break those up. And so this, as again, is as a result of the Third Sector Collaborative, which the Peter and Jan Booz Family Foundation sponsored in November and continue to sponsor this work, where we're building up the third sector in Barbados specifically. And so welcome, Peter. I see you on the line. Glad that you're with us today. So as I mentioned, what we're covering today is specific to the registrar, how you register and the ongoing obligations. There are other obligations outside of what we'll talk today. For instance, BRA has a set of obligations. We might refer to those, but that won't be the focus. Okay, so this is the agenda for today. We're going to tee it up at the beginning just to talk about this notion of governance and compliance. Why would you want to do this? What is the foundation for why you do register and why there are obligations? Then we're going to talk a bit about the difference between a charity and a nonprofit, because this causes a great deal of confusion, especially in Barbados, because you need to be one or the other. And then we'll talk about registration, specifically charities. How do you register your charity? Nonprofits, how do you register a nonprofit? And then we'll talk about what the obligations for you as a charity will be, and what the obligations specifically for a nonprofit would be. Okay, so let's kind of lay the foundation for this. We are going to keep referring to the registrar. So the registrar was formerly named CAIPO and is now named Business Barbados. Okay, and now and as it says here, they are responsible for regulation of business matters at the corporate registry. They're also, they maintain administration of the IPO. We're not going to touch upon that today, but that's also in the CAIPO/Business Barbados remit. And so there's some reasons that registration happens and these things are enforced. So in a time in the not too distant future, Barbados ended up on something called a gray list by the Financial Action Task Force. And it was an indication that there was risk in Barbados investment. And so unfortunately, what it does if you end up on a gray list is it tells the world, oh, this might be a kind of a tricky place to invest. We have some concerns with this area. And so it does affect Barbados as a whole. So it's no longer on the gray list. The registrar's response was to take kind of a holistic view. One of the things that had come out of the assessment was that there needed to be better enforcement of some of these procedures. And so that is what the registrar is attempting to do. It is not specific to charities and nonprofits. This would be something that is being enforced across the board. But what it means is that everyone has to participate in this these procedures so that Barbados as a whole can not only keep themselves off the gray list, but be seen as a place that is a good place to invest in, for instance. So the background behind this, when we talk about risk, is that charities and nonprofits are considered to be high risk. This is not only in Barbados. I tried to set up money transfers for a charity I was doing work with in Canada overseas, and we had a very difficult time getting a platform to transfer money because we were told charities are high risk, even though my charity was very small and I consider to be low risk. That is besides the point, because generally speaking, globally, they have been targeted for money laundering, fraud, and funding terrorist activities. We're not suggesting that any of you are doing that, and that and that when that happens, it is to your knowledge, but this is something that happens globally. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between a charity and a nonprofit. Because in Barbados, you have to choose, okay? So this section will be important for you if you're trying to figure out which one you are, or important for you if you are trying to decide what type of organization, what type of structure you should create and register under, okay? So the charities fall under a different act, a different legal foundation called the Charities Act. In Barbados, if you are a charity, you are also a trust, and therefore you also fall under the Trustee Act. Okay, so the Charities Act is going to be the basis by which a lot of what we cover is founded under. Now, if you're a nonprofit, you are considered a company without share capital, and so the foundation that you are governed by is the Companies Act. And you will know that you are a nonprofit company if your name ends in Inc. for incorporated or Corp for corporation. Okay. And I'll emphasize this again because it's very confusing, that you have to be one or the other. And so it's important to choose wisely if you're choosing, because if you wanted to switch, you would have to dissolve one and create in another structure. Okay, so if I step back, the big picture is charities are governed under the Charities Act, nonprofits are governed under the Companies Act. Okay, so a charity, there is a definition for a charity. In the Charities Act under Section 3, it's actually a very long definition with many, many paragraphs. The gist of it is, and the paragraphs kind of go through, if you are this, if you are that, you might be considered to be a charity. The gist of it is you have to have a charitable purpose. And by this, loosely, it's defined as any benevolent or philanthropic institution or organization established with the object or purpose of helping those in need. And it's important that you would be able in your application to justify or explain what your charitable purpose is. Okay, so that's kind of what defines a charity. A nonprofit, similar, it has a restricted purpose. And so CAIPO, the registrar's website still refers to CAIPO. So some of the references I have in the slide deck, which we'll send out, do still refer to the KIPA website. That's what it's still listed as. All that to say, it's defined as one that is patriotic, religious, philanthropic, charitable, educational, scientific, literary, historical, artistic, social, professional, fraternal, sporting, or athletic nature or the like, or to the promotion of some other useful object. So same sort of thing, that there has to be an intention and the activities have to surround this restricted purpose. Okay, so that's a little bit about charity versus nonprofit. Now, if we get into the details of each of them, there's some things to keep in mind. So we mentioned the structure. Charities fall under the Charities Act and nonprofits fall under the Companies Act. So in a nonprofit, you would lay out what you're about and how you operate under the Articles of Incorporation. And a charity would outline this in something like a trust agreement or a deed or their constitution. Okay, and we'll talk about registration, how you would submit these documents so the registrar would understand your activities and the purpose of your organization. Now, there are differences in the cost. Charities have a much lower cost to meet obligations because to register is free. And one of the big things that we'll talk about is you don't have to have an audited statements when you're a charity. Whereas nonprofits, there's a higher level of care with their annual accounts. And we'll talk about that some more. Likewise with filings, there's additional filings to be done for nonprofits, which we'll talk about. Nonprofits are considered to be a separate legal personality or entity. Okay. And because they're a company, they also have to do a domestic annual return. All right, so let's take a step back and think about what you would think about when deciding. Now, before I do that, I just want to do kind of a side note. If you are a society or an association, you can be a charity or a nonprofit, and you probably are also governed by some of these acts. Now, this is something to keep in mind. So when wondering how do you tell the registrar if you're a charity about what you do, some of these acts might govern whether you need, let's say, bylaws, a trust agreement, or a deed to explain that. And so you would then use that information to communicate with the registrar in the process. So for instance, cooperative societies have their own act, building societies, friendly societies, industrial and provident societies act. And I think there are some associations that also have an act. So the reason we say this is simply to say, if you're a charity, you are defined by the Charities Act, nonprofits, Corporations Act, but you may also have some governing principles depending if you are in a society or association. Okay, so what do you need to think about if you are deciding what structure to enter into, or deciding if you're in the right structure, if you are having notions about changing that? And here's the questions you need to ask yourself as an organization. The first one, what do your donors require? So it may be that your donors want you to, if you have a large donor, they might want you to operate like a large company and have some rigor in place where a nonprofit would be their preference. There are many donors that would want you to be a charity so they could take advantage of the charitable donation tax receipts, for instance. Another question would be, what are your organizational goals? So there's something to keep in mind when you are thinking about the work that your organization is going to do. A charity must entirely be about that charitable purpose. If you are going to go into a more complex structure where you are developing revenue for the sake of a charitable purpose, it might be that you are better qualified to be a nonprofit. because again, you have to uh, file for application for these, and the registrar would have to approve those. Do you need to keep costs to a minimum? So as I mentioned, and I'll go in more depth, there will be a higher cost to register and ongoing obligations for a nonprofit. And so the other question is, do you have the resources to meet those ongoing statutory obligations? And are there activities such that would benefit from limited liability? So I mentioned something called limited liability. And a company is considered, as I mentioned, a separate personal entity, a separate entity from the people that run it. So what this means is if you are on the board or if you are managing a company with limited liability, you cannot be held responsible for, let's say, the debts of that organization. Now, that does not preclude you from personal liability if you're found to have acted, let's say, for fraud or been involved in something that you are personally liable, then there is a duty of care there. But the notion of limited liability is that the organization is a separate entity from those running it. So these are the things you would have to consider for your organization, and some of the things you should ask yourself if you're wondering which to structure as. Now, I saw Malu, I think you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
I did, yes. Thank you so much, Sherry. I was just curious. I mean, you kind of answered it by touching on the part about, I guess, activities as on behalf of the organization. So, I'm just thinking, for example, of the term like a social enterprise, where you are, providing services, even some like of the animal welfare groups, for example, they offer like spay and neutering. I'm just using that as an example. Um, and you generate revenue from that service that you provide. Does that then kind of knock you from one of the grouping to the other? Because I think it's a little bit of a gray area in that sense. Like, are you allowed to generate income for the organization as a charity?
No, and I think this is a gray area. And this is why I mentioned that when all said and done, the registrar will accept your application on a case by case basis. Now, the example you gave, um, if we take something like, let's say, Ocean Acres, who is very involved in helping animals, and you have a clinic for spade and neutering, that actually is part of your charitable purpose. If you, let's say, if I take something that's way more out there, if you have a hedge fund that you are running for the strict purposes of generating revenue for a charity, you probably would be setting up a nonprofit for two reasons in that case. One, for the liability of an investment firm, which would be considered high risk. And two, because a nonprofit, everything a nonprofit makes has to go back into the business by nature. A nonprofit is a company with no share capital, and therefore there are no dividends or equity distributions that would go out to shareholders. So in that case, all the money still is coming to a charitable or a restricted purpose, let's say, but the nature of running an investment firm is not in itself a charitable purpose. Those would be the type of things where you would have to have a business case. I think that would be a harder sell for a charity. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's not that you can't make money. And this is one thing we talked about in our value proposition workshop. We want people to make money. We want them to feel not just that they're providing a service, but they are effectively doing it at a level that a private sector company could, but everything's being invested in the purpose in which they stand for. So let's talk about registration. The registrar is where you do registration. Okay. So again, just reminding you that a charity, for those just joining us, a charity has to have a charitable purpose. Under Section 3 of the Charities Act, that's kind of listed out, but it's a benevolent or a philanthropic institution. Okay. Whoops. think I hit the link. So this is the Charities Act, and it's a many pages long. In the PowerPoint presentation, we have a link to it. And this I'm going to call it KYPO because it's still labeled KYPO, but this is the register site. So a couple things I want to point out, starting with registering a charity. Excuse me. There is a separate, so you see it's under incorporation, and it's got a list of the things that you can incorporate or register is probably a better term for this page. So you can register a charity, and it takes you through, there's some FAQs and stuff to do so. But this is the item that you're going to be interested in, the application for registration of a charity. And so basically, this information you have to fill out. It also acts as a name search. So they want to make sure, the registrar wants to make sure that there is not another organization with your name. And it's done through the same document. It's done differently for nonprofits, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's asking where you established. It's asking for the address. It's asking for the names of the trustees. Keisha said there's a general minimum of 3 trustees that have to be resident in Barbados. And you would put that information. So this is like what we call the standing data. You put a list of the property owned by charity. And by properties, we don't necessarily mean land or physical. It could be bank accounts, anything of value. Now, we'll talk about vested property in a minute, but generally speaking, when you register, you might not have a lot of these properties, let's say, and there's a process by which when they're added to the organization, you let the registrar know. Okay, so all that to say, this application is a lot of standing data. You would accompany this with your constitution, your deed, your trust agreement, the document that tells the registrar, or tells everyone for that matter, how you operate and how that works. Okay, now I will note something, and this goes for both charities and nonprofits. You'll see at the top of the page, there's buttons for login or to register. And so if you have a KYPO account, you're already set up. If not, you would register with KYPO to get an account by which you could upload this document and your legal documents. That's for both charities and nonprofits. Charities, you have to fill out this form and physically attach it as an upload to the register. We'll talk about nonprofits are a little bit different. So as I mentioned, there's a few things you have to think about. First thing is that there are very few organizations in Barbados that are exempt from this requirement. They are the likes of things like BCC, Barbados Community College, those exempted by the Auditor General, and any charity that has no permanent endowment. So that would be like a pool of funds sustaining the charity, or income greater than 100 Barbados dollars. And you're probably thinking, who operates with less than 100 Barbados dollars? You would have to set it up. An example would be Bajans Helping Bajans. They partner with Bridge Supermarket. The funds go to Bridge Supermarket, whose staff put together the hampers, and Bajans Helping Bajans delivers those hampers. So technically, there is no cash flow through Bajans Helping Bajans. That's an example. So you would have to structure it as such. Most organizations are going to operate with over $100 to make things happen. So I showed you, so just keep in mind that technically every charity should be registering. I showed you the registration form and these documents to submit with your trust deed is free. So charities have a very low entry as far as the cost to register goes. Okay, So in this document, I showed you the document with standing data. In this document that accompanies it, whether it's your trust agreement, your deed, you should be putting additional information in it. And again, this will be in the slides and the video that gets distributed. So you want obviously the name of the charity, the trustee powers, how you're going to do business, how you're going to conduct minutes, meetings, the vesting of property. We'll talk about that again, your location, how you're going to do your financial statements, and also if you were to wind up, what does that look like? And in absence of this being set, in a wind up, your assets would go to another charity of like cause in Barbados. Okay, so these are some of the things you really have to think about as you're setting up an organization and letting the registrar know these have been thought through. And this is often what a lawyer would help you with because they draw these up often. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about nonprofits. Now I showed you the website. There's a section for nonprofits. And when you log in, companies have more of a digital platform. So you would enter the information into the digital platform rather than create a separate document that you would upload. And so there are forms for all these things we're going to talk about. So I mentioned a name search with the charities. That's done with your application. Because this is a company, a nonprofit is a company, there are various things you have to do. The first is a name search. It's called Form 33. It costs $30. And you submit what you want to be called, and a search is done to make sure that someone doesn't already have that name. Some organization isn't already called that you don't want confusion. Then you would want to say what your registered addresses are, who your directors are, and this is part upon incorporation of this thing we call Form 2, which are your articles of incorporation. Now note that this costs $150 to register. So there is a cost to registering a nonprofit. Okay, so let's look at what the obligations are. And again, we're encouraging you to know what the obligations are so that you can have your files updated and know the first step is probably, if you are unsure, you should go to the registrar and see what they have on file and make sure that they have not only your initial documents, but those that have been required on an annual basis. So if you're not sure, see what's on file, and we'll talk about how you deal with it if it's not up to date. All right, so again, the charities are the ones that have a charitable purpose, are set up as a charity. For a charity, there's a few things you have to do on an ongoing basis. If there are any changes to your charity, so we'll talk about it in a sec. If there are any changes to the charity, you have to let the registrar know, and we'll talk about the timelines around that. There is an annual filing that's required for a charity, and something called a statement of accounts has to be produced annually. And again, we'll differentiate that from what the nonprofits are required of. And if there's any change of purpose to your business, this has to be also filed with the registrar. Okay, so these are kind of the areas we're going to look at. All right, so you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a few things that if these change, there is an expectation that you will register with the charity what the change is within 15 days of the change, okay? So if your name changes, that's kind of a big one. They would have to make that change and reissue documentation. Any of the trustee names, and we'll talk in a minute what the most defaults in this are. And so even if one of your trustees passes away and you get a new trustee, you have to let the registrar know that. If the address of your registered office changes or any changes to your constitution. Okay, so to reiterate, this should be done within 15 days of the change. Okay, vesting property is called vesting property. If you attain properties. And again, this is not just land. This is any assets. You need to declare what the charity holds. Okay. And so this has to be done within 1 month of the change. The annual statement of accounts. So according to Section 41 of the Charities Act, you have an obligation every year to submit a statement of accounts. So what this means is there has to be a statement of income and expenditures. And again, there's not a lot of rigor for charities around what that looks at. You need to show what's coming in for funds and what's going out for expenditures for the 12-month period. And also a balance sheet, which means you have to show what your assets are and what your liabilities and your debts are and what that net equity balance is. Okay. These must be registered with the registrar within a month of the 12-month period ending. And people are like, how am I supposed to get an audit done within a month of year end? You do not need an audit for a charity. Okay. This is a big misnomer in Barbados. You need to submit a statement of accounts and a balance sheet within a month of your 12-month period ended. Okay, so you pick your what we call a fiscal year end, and that's the date every year that you take stock and say, what's my income and expenditures, and what are my assets and liabilities? And within a month of that date, you should be registering with the registrar. Okay.
So Sherry,
there's
a question on penalties if you do not meet these deadlines.
We are going to get to penalties. We're going to save that for the end so people don't get scared about what this means. So the next section we'll talk about penalties. So hold that thought. Change of purpose. So if you change what you're about, especially your charitable purpose, this needs to be registered. And how do I say that? It's illegal, it's an offense to say you're a charity when you actually are no longer one, but you're operating as one and giving out tax receipts and getting tax exemptions. You need to not do that. You need to cease. But it's not enough just to stop operations. You have to become dormant and let the registrar know that that's happened. Okay. All right, so let's talk about penalties, and then I'm going to pause for people to ask questions about the charity portion before I go to nonprofits. So I mentioned if there are changes to your charities, they're to be made within 15 days of the change. The fine for not doing so is $100. Okay, so there's a list of changes that you need to be cognizant of, that if it changes, you should register those. Vesting of property. So within a month of a variation or an addition of vested property, those should also be sent to the registrar. And the annual filings, as I mentioned, you do not require an audit. However, if in a risk assessment, the registrar deems that they would like you to have an audit, they can impose, I guess is the word. They can ask that that be done at your expense. Okay. And failure to provide information to the auditor is an offense. Okay, so this is the scary part that I wanted to leave to the end. So there are penalties for these things. The changes are $100. The fines $5,000 plus $500 for every day after the conviction is obtained. This means that it was so deemed that these things had to take place, and a conviction would be that in the court of law that was obtained. Okay, so if you're hearing that and going, I don't even know if I'm on side, we'll talk about that in a second. So the most common defaults apparently are deceased trustees. No one's been given notice that there's a deceased trustee. You would have to submit a death certificate and the name of the new trustee and date. Okay. A lapse statement of account, obviously, if you don't send that to the registrar. So you would want to get your statement of accounts in order, get them signed by the trustees and send them in. if you are in a position where you're like, I don't even know where my accounts are, and by my, I mean my organization, because there might have been a change in leadership, there might have been an event where you just don't know where they are, you would be required to sign an affidavit, which is a legal document, with a resolution of the trustees, but also referring to how it is that the organization is in this position. And then you would be required to do your best to provide the information you could at your disposal to kind of reset the bar. Okay. Now, the one thing I will make a kind of a side note, because it's a little more complicated. It is possible to have a charity and have an incorporated board. Okay, you can incorporate your board so that your board is a separate entity from your organization and has a different liability. Okay, meaning it doesn't mean you abscond responsibility. If you're found to be taking negligent actions, you'll be held responsible, but you are not held, you cannot be the debts, let's say, of an organization cannot be attributed to you. They're not also yours. Okay, and there's no separate obligations of a charity whose trustees have been incorporated as a board, and a charity's board has no separate filing obligations. So let's move on to nonprofits. And again, I'll go through the nonprofits and then we'll have a pause at the end if people have been kind of mulling things over and they want to raise something. So again, for a reminder, those just joining us, a nonprofit has a restricted purpose, but it is a corporation without share capital where all the proceeds are kept for that restricted purpose. Okay. So if you're a nonprofit, here are some of the things you need to think about on an ongoing basis. The first is upon incorporation, and we talked about the process by which you would go onto the registrar's site and the digital platform and upload those forms and information. Upon incorporation, your first AGM should be within 18 months of that day. And then the following year, within the time frame of that first AGM, you should have another AGM within 15 months, so on and so forth. Now, the reason I mention this is there's a deadline with respect to financial statements that revolves around the AGM. Okay, so I'm incorporated within 18 months, I need to have an AGM. And then the next year, within 15 months of that AGM, I need to have another. Okay. The financials need to be submitted within 15 days of an AGM. Okay. Now, for a nonprofit, they must be audited. Okay, so, and I want to make the distinction that the audited statements are going in within the 15-day time frame of your AGM, not within the time frame of your year end. So people shouldn't think, I just finished the year end and within 15 days, the registrar wants my statements. No, within 15 days of the AGM, where everyone approves the statements or the trustees approve the statements, the directors, that's when they need to be submitted. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. And because a nonprofit is a company, they also need to file their domestic annual return. Okay. So what does this look like? Again, within 15 days of the AGM, you have to submit something that has a balance sheet. So what are my assets, liabilities, and the resulting equity? The revenue and expenses of the company. And because it's audited, there will be more rigor in the format, which the auditors will take you through, of course. The names and donors where donation exceeds 20,000 Barbados dollars. Okay, so this is different than a charity. The large donors have to be disclosed. And there's a report from the auditor of the company. So this is to say it's been audited and they're signing off. The directors of the company are to approve those financial statements. And that's generally what happens at the AGM so that you know they're approved and then you can then submit them. There's something called the domestic annual return, and all the companies in Barbados have to do this. And because a nonprofit is a corporation without share capital, they have to file a domestic annual return. So here is the piece of information that you need to figure out. When do you file? What is your incorporation date? So the date we're talking about here is the date that you registered with the registrar and were incorporated. If you were incorporated between January 1st and June 30th, the next year, you have to file your annual return by June 30th. So if I'm incorporated between January 1st and June 30th, 2024, I need to get my annual return in this month. Okay. If I'm incorporated between July 1st and December 31st, I have until December 31st the next year to file my annual return. So if I'm incorporated November 2024, I have until the end of this year, 2025, to file my annual return. But there's nothing to keep you from filing it as soon as the information is ready. And it is a detail, it's a return of details. They're going to ask you a lot of the same things we saw in the initial application. You're verifying your address, you're verifying there's no change of business, things like that. Okay, but those are the deadlines you need to meet for the domestic annual return. If there's a change of director, similar with the trustees in a charity, if you have a change of directors, you should be letting the registrar know that within 15 days using this Form 9. Okay, so let's talk about penalties for nonprofits. Get to the scary part at the end. You need to have audited financial statements. Again, the fine is $5,000 or $500 for every day after conviction is obtained. So this would be something in a court of law that deems that you have a conviction, and the penalties start from that time. If you fail to submit your domestic return, and I will admit I've been one of these people in the past, it's $10 a day payable to the registrar every day that the default continues up till $3,000. So it's kind of important you figure out with the registrar if you've missed some of these deadlines, because as soon as you get on side, the sooner you can stop that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the change of directors, the fine is 100 days if it's not filed within $100 if not fined within 15 days. And technically, every director or officer who knowingly and willingly authorizes or permits a default is also liable for these penalties. So this would be an instance where limited liability doesn't quite follow through. Okay, so the message is, if you think you're offside, first of all, go to the register, see what they have. You might be offside and you don't even know it. Go to the register, see what Business Barbados has online or in person for you, and get on side. The other thing to keep in mind is that the registrar is not able to waive penalties. That is, the registrar just collects information, and you would have to go to the Ministry of Finance to get a penalty waived. And I know people who have done that and who have been successful. It does happen, but you do have to make a separate application for that to happen. Okay. And kind of an end side note, if you're going to dissolve a nonprofit, it has to be done through articles of dissolution. You can't just stop operating and disappear. And you need a copy of the director's resolution or an affidavit signed by director and officer that says you're discharging obligations. Okay. And then if a nonprofit winds up, whatever's left in the nonprofit would go to a charitable organization in Barbados, and you can outline that in your original articles of incorporation. Okay, so again, a lot of information thrown at people about nonprofits. Does anyone have any questions surrounding that they would like to ask?
We let her to apply for the waiving of the waiving of
Ministry of Finance?
Yes. Do you apply for that before you send the necessary information to the registrar? Like, what is the order?
That is a really good question, Jamila. I think if the first thing is to contact the registrar and see where you're at. If you have the information, it probably makes sense to do it ASAP, so all penalties cease accumulating, and then you'll know what your balance is and what you are requesting of the Ministry of Finance.
So when you're requesting that the penalties be canceled, and give a reason as to why.
Yeah, now this is probably an area that if you're going to go this route, it probably makes sense to have an accountant or a lawyer help you. I'm not saying you need to do that, but you might benefit from advice on the best way. I know an accountant who has helped clients with this because they are aware of what the best way to go about asking for these are and what the points of reference would be that best able them to understand the organization's situation.
Okay.
Now, I'm not able to kind of give you advice on that,
Mhm.
but there are, I guess the answer is there are people in Barbados that know how this works and are able to help you do it. But yes, you would have to make basically a business case for why your penalties would be waived.
And I guess this is leading into my next question.
Mhm.
What is the legal minimum amount of directors that you should have when prior directors have stepped down?
That was a great question about the directors. And to answer that question, we decided to go straight to the source. See a note here, it's chapter 308, companies. We are going to scroll down to page 191, and you'll see here that there is part 3, other registered companies, companies without share capital. So we mentioned that a non-profit company does not have share capital. And if we scroll to section 316, you'll note that this is labeled directors, and it reads, a nonprofit company may have no fewer than 3 directors. So here's the closing thoughts, and then I'll pause to see if people have any other comments or questions. We encourage you to make an informed decision about a legal structure. If you're embarking in this as something that's new, have a real think about those consideration questions we asked about being a charity or nonprofit, because they will be good guidance in having you think through what's the best for you. Understand your regulatory obligations as we've gone through, and make sure that you know what they are, and then of course file and comply. And for more complicated situations, of which there are many, there have been other case studies people brought to us, and it gets complicated, you might want to seek legal advice. That is not to say that you need a lawyer to do a lot of the things that we've just discussed, but there are times where if your situation is complicated or you're walking into a complicated situation that has been created over years, you might want to get legal advice and maintain your files going forward. Okay, so wherever you are today, clean it up and move forward with a clean slate. So I just want to thank the Peter and Jan Booz Family Film Foundation, right back to the collaborative where we talked about a lot of these things, through to the webinars that we've created to build capacity and collaboration. The Booz Foundation has been the foundation for that. And want to also thank Keisha Hyde-Porchetta. While she's not here today, she was an integral part of putting this together. And Keisha, our thoughts are with you. And if there's questions, you can continue to communicate with us through info@barbadosthirdSector.org. And we've got, and so just want to thank everyone for coming today and spending some time on their lunch hour for many of you to join us. So thank you.